Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes. I'm just going to wait for a couple more folks to trickle in if y'all don't mind.
It's nice for me to see some familiar names. Hello, Joe, Rachel Ingold, Gail Henderson, good to see you here.
All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for joining us for the Bullitt History of Medicine Club. My name is Alan. I'm a first year medical student here at UNC. Today's lecture is by Dr. Nicole Barnes. Just some housekeeping before I introduce the lecture. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box. The lecture is also going to be recorded. I think you can see that the Zoom's recorded right now, but we're going to be moving all the lectures, the recordings, to new servers, so past lectures are unfortunately currently unavailable. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of Dr. Barnes. Dr. Barnes was a former professor of mine at Duke when I was an undergrad. She's an assistant professor of history and gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University. She is an author of the award-winning open access book, Intimate Communities, Wartime Healthcare and the Birth of Modern China, 1937 to 1945. Published in 2018 through the University of California Press. She is currently writing a social and ecological history on night soil and toilets in modern China. And yes, I see that the link is here. Awesome, that's great. So it's an open access book, so y'all should check it out. But yeah, without further ado, I'm going to just turn it over to Dr. Barnes.
Thanks so much, Alan, for that introduction. It's always lovely to see past students too, and to see you thriving over in med school at UNC. It's really, really a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm going to try to cram a ton of stuff in because I'm so passionate about this topic. So in slight bullet points, we're going to go through 5 essential points on the history of Western medicine as context to understand my main point, that all medical systems are relevant, and the current dominant hegemonic worldwide medical system of biomedicine that you all are studying is just one version of a bodily truth. So to historicize Western medicine, 5 essential points I'll walk you through. First point has multiple aspects. Western medicine went through revolutionary changes. The first one was spurred by the 1543 publication of Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libris Septim on the construction of the human body in 7 books. Rachel Ingold is here. She's the chair of our History of Medicine library collection here at Duke. We have an original print of this book. So if you're all at UNC, make the trip to Duke. Forget basketball rivalries. You all can gloat now anyway. Come on down and see this book. It is amazing. It contains illustrations such as this that depicted the human form for among the first time. He was not the absolute first, but among the first time in lifelike format. It also, the text of that book revolutionized the study of human anatomy and therefore medicine after several decades of contention and rivalry and strife, because no change is ever immediate, because Vesalius had access to the bodies of executed criminals, human executed criminals, whereas Galen, the Roman physician who had become the father of Western medicine that was dominant across Europe for many, many centuries, had primarily looked at pigs and apes and occasionally the Roman gladiator. So Vesalius pointed out places where Galen had gotten it wrong. There was physical proof from these new corpses that he was wrong, and therefore we should, Vesalius argued, discard all of what we know about medicine because we were wrong about what's in the human body. So pay attention to this factor. The first major revolution in Western medicine, this sparked by this 1543 publication, was based on what people could physically see from the body. The next major revolution didn't really take place until the 1800s, 19th century, and that's been termed the therapeutic revolution. This was a revolutionary change in the ways that physicians related to their patients. It was a transformation from the house call physician who gets on his buggy and drives right to your house and comes in and has some tea and asks about your family members because he knows everybody and he probably delivered your child and now that child is 7 and has a fever and you're going to go see him. So it's kind of that intimate connection to a whole family in their actual domestic space, transitioning to, over the course of that century, the clinic, the hospital, a more depersonalized space. And then now kind of fast forward to today's HMO, where the physicians are wearing, geo identifiers and have to be clocking out with a patient within 15 minutes or getting penalized because we're working in profit-based hospitals. Sorry to spoil any romance you might have about medicine, future doctors. You are most likely going to be working for an entity that really prioritizes profit and struggles to prioritize the person. So this began with the 19th century therapeutic revolution. The next one, circa 1900, becoming dominant, was the development of tropical medicine, which scholars term colonial medicine. And this is really two ways to refer to the same thing. Tropical medicine is a way to designate the fact that Europeans believed that white bodies were susceptible to these new diseases in Asia and Africa, the places that they wanted to colonize, which they termed the tropics, because they tended to be warmer locales, honestly, where mosquitoes were very prevalent. Here in the southern US, that was also the case, carrying yellow fever, malaria, diseases that were very, very deadly prior to any kind of medicaments that could fight them, much less a vaccine. So the tropical medicine denotes the white European perspective on these diseases, whereas colonial medicine in scholarship bears this note from Biswamoy Patti and Mark Harrison, scholars of colonial India, who say that medicine was also intended as a bearer of Western cultural values that would bind Indians, that is South Asians, more closely to their colonial masters. So in scholarship, we refer to it as colonial medicine to denote that it was not just a way of keeping white bodies safe and healthy, it was also a whole epistemic culture and a presumption of biomedicine, or Western medicine at the time, being the rightful way to think about health and healing, and indigenous medicines as much lesser, of much lesser value, and therefore those peoples. So the implicit assumptions in these labels, just so we're clear, tropics are a problem that Europeans must overcome to keep their own bodies healthy. They're a foreign land to these European bodies, and that's defined solely from a European perspective, later also white North American perspective. But colonial medicine in scholarship asserts that medicine was a tool of empire, that it was a core part of the civilizing mission in colonies where medical missionaries were instrumental agents, and that saving lives was really also about controlling culture and commanding resources. So that's just that quote again. There were also 3 schools of thought in tropical medicine, and I just want to, some of this information, honestly, I'm including because I don't know if all of you, like Alan Zhao, were able to take a course such as mine. Alan was in my advanced reading seminar on history and anthropology of medicine when he was here at Duke. Some of you may not have had that, and here you are in medical school, you don't know the history. It's really important. So there were 3 predominant schools. Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, of course, the fathers of germ theory, as we'll discuss in just a moment, really were focused on developing and administering drugs that targeted the particular disease to the victims or potential victims. Manson and Ross were within the vector school. They said, let's control mosquitoes, make sure that we can control where they go. Nowadays, we're controlling their breeding capacities by releasing genetically modified male mosquitoes that are sterile. And then the kind of British school, very much out of tropical medicine, was removal. The removal thought, like, the white bodies are susceptible because native bodies have innate immunities. So let's remove the white bodies to like hill sites, colonial hill sites above the mosquito line in India, for example. And then the next major change came in the 19th century. This is what we call germ theory, or the laboratory revolution. And of course, here we have our two fathers of germ theory, Robert Koch, who represented the Prussian Empire, future Germany, and Louis Pasteur, who represented France. Now, an interesting facet of their relationship is that they hated each other's guts. Koch had been a military doctor in the Franco-Prussian War. So they were living at a time when their two nation states were at war with each other. The Prussians, Germans hated the French, and vice versa. And this is actually really important to the development of modern medicine, because each time one man came up with, Pasteur came up with the germ theory, and Koch says that's not enough. You need the postulates to verify that the germ theory is working properly. And then this disease, that disease, this disease, that disease. It was the fact that their empires were at competition with each other, and they were at competition with each other, although they largely remained cordial in public spaces, that the innovations came so quickly, rapidly, one on the other, right? So Louis Pasteur, germ theory, and Robert Koch says we have to have these four postulates. We have to verify that this is what you're seeing under that microscope is the causative agent. Got to go through all the four steps that you all know very well, so I don't need to walk through them. And pay attention to the actual medium too. You also had to have Julius Petri inventing the petri dish, what we call the petri dish in English. Because of course, you all know from the laboratory, if you cannot isolate your organism and keep other things that are floating around in the air out of your culture, your whole study goes awry, right? So you actually have to have something as simple as the petri dish with agar-agar jelly to make the whole laboratory revolution happen. It goes all the way down to the basic elements, right? But the Jenner's smallpox vaccination was actually not modern laboratory medicine. It was inductive reasoning. It was his observation of what happened to the dairy maids who had exposure to cowpox, and then experimenting with the farm boy, and then his own other children. But the germ theory of disease, as of 1862 with Louis Pasteur's theory, and then going through Koch's postulates, led to this whole strain of developments. And pay attention to it. It's like Pasteur, Koch, or Ehrlich, who was one of Koch's chief students. Pay attention also to further down the line, there are some Japanese names here. Dr. Kitasato Shibasawaro and Dr. Shigat Kyoshi, which I just learned from Alan Zhao in talking just before the talk, that you guys have all learned very recently in your GI block about Dr. Shiga's discovery of the dysentery bacillus, the Shigella bacillus that causes one particular strain of dysentery. Dr. Kitasato Shibasawaro also was, like Paul Ehrlich, a protege of Robert Koch, worked in his laboratory and made major developments and discoveries in modern medicine alongside Paul Ehrlich. When Ehrlich was given the Nobel Prize for the discovery that he made alongside Dr. Emil von Behring was given the Nobel Prize shortly after this 1890 discovery, which he made with Dr. Kitasato of the tetanus serum. In the Nobel Prize Committee never considered Kitasato's contributions. Von Behring never mentioned having worked alongside Dr. Kitasato in the laboratory in his acceptance speech. So this is a concrete example I give to you of the supremacy of white European culture, where the Japanese scientists' contributions to modern medicine were just written out of history. Except in Japan, where Dr. Kitasato returned, having worked alongside the preeminent German scientists in the Koch's laboratory, returned to Japan, founded the Infectious Disease Institute, did a lot to promote modern biomedicine, laboratory medicine in modern Japan in the universities. And he is so widely celebrated across Japan. Everyone knows him. He's like a national hero. In Europe, he's virtually unknown because he was written out of history. Dr. Kitasato Shiwasaburo also had another major contribution. That was when the third global plague pandemic hit in the late 1890s. It emerged in southern China, made its way to Hong Kong, which by 1894 was a British colony, knitted to the entire world via the British ships that went everywhere. And Alexandre Yersin, representing the French government, and Dr. Kitasato, representing the Japanese government, both went to Japan at that time to try to discover the causative agent of bubonic plague. They understood the connection to rats, but did not yet quite get the importance of keeping the rats off of the ships. So of course, this became a global plague pandemic when the rats bearing fleas, bearing the bacillus, went onto the ships and took it all over the world. For those of you in the United States knowing anything about Asian American history in the US, when it got to both San Francisco and Honolulu, white public health officials there responded very draconian, in a very draconian fashion against the local Chinatowns in Hong Kong. They burned Chinatown, not Hong Kong, Honolulu. They burned the Chinatown to the ground. All the people's homes, effects, everything were just destroyed. And the entire Chinatown in Honolulu, which is still world famous, was rebuilt after that in 1901. It was the fire. Similarly, in San Francisco, the white American public health officials did very, very enforced quarantine, highly racialized this disease. So what we have seen in COVID with the ex-president calling it the Hong Kong flu, or sorry, what does he call it? The Kong flu, the Wuhan virus, racializing it, and then leading to a spike in anti-Asian violence, racist violence, which has been so devastating. That was an echo of something that happened a little over a century ago. And that is very common in history of medicine that you may know. This story also, the thing that I want you to know about it is that Dr. Kitasato Shiwasaburo dispersed, so these two men were trying to discover the causative agent of plague, which was not yet known. And they began to look at the bodies, the deceased bodies of people who had died of the disease to try to isolate it. Kitasato did it first, but people argued that he had made a mistake. So Yersin did it second. And as you know, it's called Yersinia pestis. So again, the white man's name was put on this discovery, even though in actuality, Kitasato was first. And he for a second time written out of history. And here is the man, Dr. Shigat Kyoshi, who did discover the Shigella bacillus that you have recently studied and that now I am quite interested in via my second project that Alan mentioned, the social and ecological history of night soil and toilets. That this is a project that intersects with global health projects against open defecation and presumptions of kind of sewage systems as being the most modern system, even though they waste the nutrients that are present in human excrement and urine and waste potable water during a global climate crisis. So I'm trying to argue that we should actually think instead about how to save our potable water and harness the resources, the nitrogen, the potassium, the phosphates that are present in human waste, but neutralize them so that we don't spread bacteria for disease. And we actually have all the technologies to do all of that. We just have to get over our yuck factor. So that's your long list of developments in modern medicine with the Japanese contributors added there too. And then the next major change was professionalization, which the historian of medicine in the US, Paul Starr, has written very, very well about. This is about, the founding of professional organizations, like the professional entities that now have lobby politicians on behalf of physicians and kind of trouble the waters and render healthcare a much more explicitly politicized thing that will trouble all of you when, in my experience, all of my students like Alan who wish to go into medical care, your primary attraction is to help people. And you have, the intellectual interest in the medicine itself and in bodies, but you also really want to help people. And then you have to go work for these entities that are highly politicized and profit driven, and it can be very devastating. So this has to do very much with these historical developments, which Michel Foucault has written very compellingly about. He, as the preeminent thinker about theories and philosophies of the body, wrote about how, in his book, The Birth of the Clinic, about how the development of the laboratory revolution influenced a prioritizing of sight. Recall again what Andreas Vesalius did. He said, look into the bodies, and therefore we have a revolution of everything we've ever known about modern medicine, because what Galen tells us is there is not there. I cannot see it with my own eyes. He got it wrong. Foucault theorizes this and says the supremacy of vision as the presumed supreme sense of all the senses led to a total revolution in thought that in the European and white Euro-American encounters with other countries led to a presumption that the European germ theory laboratory revolution based type of medicine, which gave supremacy to vision, was inherently superior to any kind of medical system that granted agency, supremacy, importance to other senses. Okay, so that's the part of Foucault that I would like you to remember. As we move into my second of 5 points, and I promise I'll get through these, the next are a little bit quicker, that the so-called alternative and orthodox medicines have always developed side by side and are mutually constitutive of each other. You cannot actually separate them. It's never been the case that you can separate them. They are shadows of one and the other. So we cannot necessarily say that orthodox medicine, and by that I mean biomedicine, the medicine you're learning, would be orthodox or would be what it is today if it had not had these encounters and interactions and blendings and hybridizations with so-called alternative medicines, which means, hence it's in quotes, it's not really alternative medicines. They have always coexisted alongside what we know as the orthodox. So this means, the third point, all medical systems are constantly evolving in relationship with each other. So if we try to draw a distinction between so-called modern and so-called traditional medicines, saying that the modern one is dynamic and ever evolving and changing and always new and revolutionary, mRNA vaccines are the newest, greatest, latest thing, and the other is just backward and static and never changing, that is a false construction. All medical systems evolve constantly. But these we can look at non-Western, so-called traditional medical systems that exist outside in our imagination of the biomedical world that have preserved into the year 2022 a sense of their own essence. They tend to share some certain characteristics that are worthy of note. One is that they often train in discipleship, in a kind of master-disciple, master-student relationship that is personalized and a very close study, rather than what you're doing in a university program, right? They often also are characterized at their core by theories that talk about balance of humors or essences, and I'll talk about that more explicitly in a moment. They often also have the characteristic that was pulled out of Western medicine in that 19th century transformation of greater intimacy and more time spent in the patient-physician interaction. That's not a universal, of course. None of these are universals. They do have gender and class distinctions between different types of healers, which is also in biomedicine, obviously. Just look at the way nursing as a traditionally constructed feminine profession and the physicians as a traditionally male profession, how they are differentially treated in terms of licensing and pay structures, and authority granted in this space of the clinic. But that's also a characteristic of these non-Western medical systems. And sometimes they are also rooted in a belief in supernatural causes of health and illness. And in most of them in 2022, that aspect is very sanitized and washed out, but traditionally it is there, as it was in Western medicine. So this is a key fact. Older and alternative forms of medicine in Europe and white North America shared all of those traits that I just walked you through. And that fact had an enormous influence on how these Western peoples perceived and reacted to indigenous medical systems when they were colonizing spaces in Asia and Africa and the Americas, and they encountered these other medical systems and they said, that is backward, that resembles what we discarded. And that presumption that in order to be new and revolutionary and the best of the best type of medicine, a medical system should discard the old. That is a core presumption in biomedicine. That still to this day colors the way we see these other medical systems that have revolutionized and have evolved and have changed, but have not discarded the essential core of their theories. They've brought into the modern space some of the quote unquote old ideas. They then are still perceived to be superstitious, pseudoscience. If you Google acupuncture right now, you'll land on a Wikipedia page that calls it pseudoscience, even though there are thousands and thousands of RCTs demonstrating with double blind, following the standard protocol, that acupuncture is an efficacious treatment for X, Y, Z disease and condition, still called a pseudoscience because of this presumption. And so to put this graphically, Galenic medicine that dominated in Europe, in I should say white Europe, and also the Middle East for millennia, from Roman times onto, basically we can say roughly a century after the Vesalian anatomical revolution. So like till 1650, dominant theory, had the four humors. They had to be in balance. To put them back into balance, you would bleed in the spring. You would do, incisions in the skin, let the blood drip out, the old blood. You might use leeches to do the same, to pull out this old stagnant blood. To this day in Chinese medicine, there's a very similar theory called the five agents, which is depicted here. And they exist in concert with each other, and they represent this seasons and a kind of elemental property and certain organ systems and flavors and colors. And so it's a whole system of correspondences that for the classically trained, classically inclined Chinese medicine physician, even to this day, including people I have seen here in the Triangle, that is how you treat a patient who's presenting with a concatenation of systems. You put their systems in conversation with what centuries of classics, medical classics, have said about this five phases theory and the whole system of correspondences to counteract the system and get it back into a balance. A European eye sees this and they say, wow, that looks just like Galenic medicine. That's the old stuff that they should have trashed in order to revolutionize their medicine. But I'm here to tell you that Chinese medicine revolutionized in a different way. The story traditionally starts with this fellow Yu Yan, or Yu Yunxiu, who was trained in Japan. And as you see, he styled himself very much in the way of a modern westernized man. Studied Western medicine in Japan, adopted the suit and tie and these little lovely spectacles. He's presenting as a modern man. And when he became representative in the new Ministry of Health in the Republic of China, that is mainland China under the control of the Nationalist Party that is now a dominant party in Taiwan, but from 1911 to 1949 was one of the dominant parties in mainland China. 1928, that nationalist government established a Ministry of Health, and soon thereafter, Yu Yunxiu was designated one of the ministers, and having come in from Japan, where Dr. Kitasato Shibasaburo and Shigat Kyoshi were very influential, he'd learned modern medicine, and he learned that in order to revolutionize, you have to discard the old. So he sponsored a bill in the new Ministry of Health to outlaw Chinese medicine as a superstitious old backward practice. This was in fact something that had happened in Japan as well. He's very much bringing in this lesson from Japan. And he created this idea of a tripartite division. He said, in this 1920 publication, which he put into law in 1929, or attempted to put into law, the theory of Chinese medicine, the yin yang, the balance between the 5 agents, all that is useless, throw it in the trash. It's superstitious, backward nonsense. But the herbal medicines that happen to grow in China, the Dicroa febrifuga, the sweet wormwood that was later made into artemisinin, which the WHO still says is the very best anti-malarial drug. We can pull those into the laboratory and ascertain through lab research that they are efficacious, and we can use those. And we'll Western biomedicine allows a very important space to the empirical, to what can be perceived through your own senses, will allow through a trapdoor the personal experience of physicians, which in Chinese medical tradition is encapsulated in Yi'an. This is a medical case study genre. Hundreds of printed texts of physicians writing in detail. Patient of this name, this sex, this age, this family situation came to me with this condition. I prescribed this. This is how she responded, going through the whole case record. And these types of case records for famous physicians are still printed around China and show up in the bookstores, and people buy, medical students like yourselves, if they're at all interested in Chinese medicine, buy these texts, read through them. What did this famous physician do in this case? So that was a genre that dates from around the 12th century to the present. And that's how physicians kind of snuck in their version of the empirical for Chinese medicine. But this tripartite division really set the parameters for a debate about Chinese medicine's veracity and ability to be modern. Chinese medicine practitioners pushed back against this 1929 attempt to outlaw. They organized parades and petitions. They sent representatives to the government, and they got that bill off the table. Chinese medicine was not outlawed, as the traditional medicine in Japan was. And they established, in the end, they managed to establish the Zhongyang Guoyi Guan, the Central Institute of National Medicine. Now, they're not calling it Chinese medicine, they're nationalizing it, tying it to the idea of national essence, and establishing it in March 1931. If you know anything about Chinese history, where they have their inaugural photograph is right in front of the mausoleum constructed for Sun Yat-sen, who's considered the father of modern China. He was the creator of the 1911 revolution that toppled the Qing Empire. He's one of the most famous Chinese men, even to this day, all over the world, because in order to fund that revolution, he traveled all over the world to raise money, all over Hawaii. There are statues to Sun Yat-sen. He was actually in Denver, Colorado, my place of birth, when the revolution actually happened, talking to overseas Chinese, raising money for this revolution. But you also see that here they are depicted in kind of traditional scholarly robes. There's a couple of them that are in full Western suits, like Yu Yan, the modernizers who are really pro biomedicine, Western medicine. But these men and a couple of women, a small number of women, are really trying to represent the Chinese cultural essence. They're trying to modernize, but stay very Chinese, and they are in more the traditional robes, right? I just want to put in a plug for this absolutely brilliant book by Shan Xianglin Lei, who is a scholar from Taiwan, did his PhD at Chicago, wrote this book in English that won the Welch Medal some years ago, and it is the most brilliant book about this piece of history in modern China, if you're interested. He asked the question, how was Chinese medicine transformed from an imagined antithesis of modernity that must be outlawed and abolished to what it is today, one of the most potent symbols for China's exploration of its own modernity? And he uncovers that it was precisely in the process of the global expansion of Western medicine into China that Chinese medicine went through its historic transformation. So what do we see if we continue to employ theoretical frameworks and mindsets that put traditional and modern into dichotomous relationship rather than into nested, interwoven, constantly interacting and mutually constitutive relationship? A core facet of this is that he analyzes, explores the epistemic violence that occurred when modern science came in with this conceit of universalism. This is a universal truth about all bodies, therefore your way of looking at the body and its disease and its illness and its path of humanity is wrong. That process, the way China reacted to that in attaching Chinese medicine to the nation, calling it Guoyi, national medicine, and the Central Institute of National Medicine, I should have mentioned, the people who willingly established that entity, which was directly tied to the federal government, getting lots of support, accepted the mandate to scientize Chinese medicine, 科学化, to scientize it, to render it legible in the actual terms and mechanics of Western science. So they had to change it entirely. Fast forward to 1955, you have TCM. What we call Chinese medicine today, we constantly refer to it as TCM. That term, TCM with capitalized traditional Chinese medicine, was announced in this English language publication in 1955, very closely tied to Maoist politics and the politics of the Chinese state at that time. We can go into more detail in Q&A if you're interested. For now, I just want you to flag that TCM is a modern state centralized instantiation of Chinese medicine. It does not represent all of Chinese medicine. And the epistemic violence is in this title. Neither donkey nor horse, 非驴非马, is what critics of this process said. They said, you know, you're blending this, you're hybridizing Chinese medicine. Now it's not a donkey nor a horse. You're just making it some mongrel medicine that's, you know, sterile, useless kind of thing because it can't represent itself or either A or B. It's a blend. But of course, that's really what happens, because science was interpreted as a new religion. It's believed to be universal, so practitioners and promoters of Chinese medicine really had no choice. In order to make sure that their medical tradition, and therefore a piece of their whole culture and tradition, could survive into the present, they had to change the truth contents, the actual fundamental ideas of what Chinese medicine is and does, hence TCM. That was the brilliant outcome of that terrible process that Chinese medicine had to go through. And thanks to that, thanks to the globalization of Chinese medicine, we can all go to see Chinese medicine physicians nowadays and understand that every medical system on earth has something of value to help you understand the human condition. The only universals of human condition: we're born, we have bodies that are sometimes healthy and sometimes ill, and we die. Those are really fundamentally the only true universals of human existence. This is why I'm totally fascinated by the history of medicine. And I'd really like you to question the premise that biomedicine is the most truthful or the most valuable way of looking at that human condition. So thank you very much. Let's have some discussion. Do we have any questions? Primary care and barefoot doctors. Yes, thank you for that question. So this is another aspect of Chinese medicine that gained global recognition. The 1972 Alma-Ata Declaration, so named because it was undertaken by leaders of the WHO at Alma-Ata in what was then the Soviet Union on the Black Sea. Even though that conference was held in the Soviet Union, and that is of course where the WHO took on this idea of healthcare for all as a core value of the World Health Organization and a core goal that we should work towards that we may never achieve. At least it's a goal. The conference was held in Alma-Ata, the Soviet Union. Many people believe, and I tend to agree with them, that the Barefoot Doctor program in China was a main inspiration for that as well. So the Barefoot Doctor program was begun under Mao Zedong's rule in China in the mid-1960s. It came out of union clinics, and it was a way, in the eyes of Mao Zedong and his supporters, to get medical treatment and some form of medical expertise into rural areas that were highly underserved. Of course, today that is still the case. Every country struggles with equity of access to medical care and quality of medical care that is accessible to people. But at least in the Barefoot Doctor program, the Chinese government at the time and Chinese people attempted to get medical care available to people. The program was widely celebrated as a successful program. If you look at it more closely, there was a lot of resistance, particularly on behalf of rural people who were then told by the communist state, this is the new medical system, you have to pay into it. And it was what we might consider a small piddling amount, but to rural poor farmers, it was a lot of money. And they had no choice, they had to pay into it. And then they could see, okay, that person gets sick and then gets medical care, but I'm not sick and I still had to pay in. So there was a lot of resistance. There was also, I see a question from Gail, so I'll get to that in just a moment, but I do want to say also that one of the reasons, this comes from my colleague, Miriam Gross at University of Oklahoma, one of the reasons that the Barefoot Doctor system actually worked in locales where it did work was that you not only had the young person with very minimal training serving as the Barefoot Doctor, but you might have a so-called sent down doctor that was a physician sent down as a bad class element from cities. Okay, I'll do that. The sent down from cities into rural areas as a bad class element, but they had good medical training and they had successful practices. They probably had, medical degrees. If they were able to have a relationship with the Barefoot Doctor and behind closed doors talk about, Barefoot Doctor sees a case, doesn't know what to do, knows that this sent down doctor is in their village, can go talk to them. What do I do in this case? That kind of locale worked well because it combined the politically appropriate primary healthcare provider, Barefoot Doctor, and the politically inappropriate in Maoist China physician with actual training to provide real quality care, which tells you a little bit about what actually needs to happen for a kind of community-based grassroots primary healthcare provider system to actually work. You do need some expertise sometimes. You can't get rid of all of it. You in medical systems know that very well. So Professor Gail Henderson asked this. She says, I'm persuaded by your model of mutually interacting systems and the continued offering of a blend of Western and Chinese medicine to patients. Can you comment on what is happening with science and medical technology today? Some really fascinating stuff. Great question. Particularly in Boston, there's one particular practitioner, Ted Kapchuk, who is a practitioner of Chinese medicine, but also in Boston University's Center of Integrative Medicine. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on with people putting on probes on the heads of like Buddhist and Taoist meditators, people who meditate a lot, and tracking their brain waves and even the brain waves of people who happen to be in the room when these people are in deep meditation and how it affects their brain waves and slows them down and gets them into new metacognitive awareness levels. There's like a spillover effect, kind of like the opposite of secondhand smoke. There's really, really cool research going on. I mentioned all the RCTs on acupuncture. So much research constantly on new trials to show, to try to test the placebo effect. Does acupuncture work because you think it works? They can actually do RCTs and double-blind where a patient thinks the needle's going in, but it's actually like there's sort of like a little mechanism that makes it just sit on the surface of the skin instead of actually puncturing. And then do they notice this? I want to say when mentioning placebo effect, two things. Number one, some people say, well, that even if the needle doesn't puncture the skin, it might still be working on the meridian system because it's acupressure, right? There's just some kind of like infinitesimal pressure on the precise point that's happening. So there's some doubt cast on that. But also placebo effect from a Chinese medicine perspective, where Cartesian dualism has not been accepted. The mind's effect on the body is a known quantity and something to be celebrated. If your goal is to get the patient healthy, then it's fine and good if their mind and their belief in the medicine is helping them get to health. Let's focus on the end goal, say a lot of Chinese medicine practitioners. Let's not worry about placebo effect kind of muddying the waters and being the problem in the system that we have to try to avoid. No, let's invoke it. Sure, let's have the mind work with the body towards healing. So there's a lot of really, really interesting studies. And I'll just say one more thing before I turn to a question. Another question is that there are also many, many RCTs currently being produced, both in many more in Chinese, but also quite a few in English if you go onto PubMed and search on a couple of I'm just going to type the names out in Pinyin. A couple of recipes that have been used to great effect to treat patients with COVID. So if you present already with an active case of COVID-19, physicians of Chinese medicine will classify them into two different kinds, hot and dry, wet and cold, and accordingly give you either 清肺排毒汤 or 莲花清瘟. And these are whole recipes with many, many different herbs in them. I think 莲花清瘟has something like 12 different, that's pretty standard to have 12 different medicaments in one prescription. And both of these recipes have been shown in multiple trials to render to less than 1%, close to 0%, the number of patients who will develop severe COVID. So it's not like the vaccination that will mean you never get COVID, but it is a life-saving medicine in the sense that you can have active COVID. If you get these treatments soon enough, you'll just have it. These two medicaments support your own body's immune system well enough to fight off the disease so that you just have a very, very mild case. And then boom, bonus, you get your immunity, your natural immunity. So I'm a big proponent of that. And if you're at all interested, look up some research on it. So a question from Barry Saunders. Can you say a bit more about contemporary tensions in and around TCM? Different institutions for biomedical versus TCM training, and then Han versus ethnic provincial medical traditions. So I'm going to address the first aspect of the question first, contemporary tensions around TCM at different institutions for biomedical versus TCM training. This is a very good question. So even in China today, where there are a lot of prominent large medical schools that I should say attract students, not just within China, but from many African countries, from many Southeast Asian countries, where a lot of young people are looking to China for their professional futures. You can get a medical degree in so-called Western medicine. This is one reason why I call it biomedicine. It's been so fully indigenized in China, it doesn't make sense to call it Western medicine. So biomedicine, you all could do your degrees at a Chinese medical institution. You could even do them in English. And you'll be learning modern biomedicine. If you want to study Chinese medicine, you have to take all the coursework in biomedicine and all the coursework in Chinese medicine, which is another wholly complex, really, really difficult coursework. And then you have to pass 2 different exams to have license. So there are structural inequities that make it really challenging for a young Chinese person to choose the Chinese medicine path. This probably more than any of the things that I told you about past struggles, might be a bigger death knell for Chinese medicine. That plus, in China today, a lot of young people don't necessarily have an inkling to take Chinese medicine. It tends to work more slowly. A lot of people have the mindset that it is not modern, that it's superstitious, backward nonsense that my grandma does. If it's not in a modern pill form, you're taking it as a kind of herb. It's actually tang. It's a soup. Qingfei paidu tang. That tang is soup. It's a liquid that you create from boiling the actual medicinal parts, the roots, the herbs, the barks, the things. It tends to be very dark in color. It often tends to be bitter, sometimes extremely bitter. Even if you get it in little capsules, you usually stir it into hot water and you get the actual flavor. And it's not usually all that pleasant to a modern tongue that's so used to sweet and salty all the time ad nauseum, at excess. So those are two forces driving against Chinese medicine today. And I'll say one other thing about that. In Chinese medicine training in China today, people don't read the medical classics, the classics that a really good legitimate physician references. So I've been in traditional Korean medicine clinics in Seoul, where the TKM physician says, we do things more legitimately than they do in China, because we have, gesturing to their bookshelves where they have all of the so-called Chinese medical classics, we actually read this stuff and we refer to these classics. And then I've seen a lot of physicians here in the US who do the same, but they're operating outside of China. That's not to say that physicians, Chinese medicine physicians in China don't do it. A lot of them do, but they do it kind of on their own outside of the official structures. Okay, so there's a second aspect to Barry's question. So speaking to the tensions between Han versus ethnic provincial medical traditions. Absolutely, I wish there's a text by, I don't have it in my office here, it's at home, but very recently, I think I'm getting the title right, Gathering Medicines, actually should be by Judith Farquhar and Lily Lai, the two anthropologists who, Judy Farquhar used to be a faculty at UNC, and Lily Lai was her PhD student then at UNC, and Lily apparently was such an amazing PhD student in medical anthropology that the two of them have since collaborated on many publications. And their most recent collaboration is this fantastic book called Gathering Medicines, I believe, on precisely how TCM, as a standardized, state-accredited, licensed, universalized, controlled form of modern Chinese medicine, has become the standard against which ethnic minority medicines, Yao medicine, Miao medicine, all the other ethnic minority medicines of non-Han Chinese peoples, now are modernizing their own medical systems. Okay, we have to have a standardized medical terminology. We have to have textbooks that are standardized. We have to have a licensing procedure. We have to have this and that. So TCM has not only gotten into the WHO, where it is really serving as a model for global health practitioners around the world for how a nation can recognize and standardize and render legally legible its indigenous medical system, but also within China, it's serving as the model for non-Han ethnic minority medicines. It has also done that for Tibetan medicine, and that is most well represented in the Mensi Kang, which is like the Tibetan autonomous region's main so-called autonomous region's main medical establishment, medical college in Lhasa. But then there's also different versions of Tibetan medicine across cultural Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, the whole Himalayan region in northern India, of course, in Dharamsala, and Tibetan government in exile. Oh, Barry Saunders recently hosted Lily Lai. That's really good to know. And anyone here might be interested. Lily Lai is pursuing visiting scholar status here at Duke, I think beginning next spring. So she may be returning to the area. And I know that if she's, officially hosted by Duke, she'll still be hanging out with everyone at UNC. She's a fantastic scholar, and Judith Farquhar as well. So those are all, yes, small world. Despite our basketball rivalries, we can still be good friends. Honestly, I don't care about basketball at all, but I'm just mentioning that since the game was so recent. What rivalry, of course. Nothing. Any other questions? We have 2 minutes left, and I'd love to entertain any questions. Well, if not, I thank you all for hosting me today. It's been a delight to talk with you. As you can tell, I will always talk ad nauseum about any of these topics.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. So broad ranging, so interesting to see all the richness and diversity of medicine that is not Western medicine also. Well, thank you for coming. We really, really appreciate it at the Bullitt. Also, once again, thank you, Alan, for doing all the legwork of inviting and of emceeing. Thank you once again to Nadia Clifton and Don Lucas for being our partners with the library, and to all of you for coming. And with Dr. Barnes's talk, we conclude our cycle of spring talks for the Bullitt. Thank you all very much for coming. Please send us any suggestions that you might have for topics or speakers that you would like to see highlighted in the fall and spring of next year. I'm going to put here on the chat the link for the Bullitt, and also my email, of course.
Should maybe stay in touch with Lili Lai at PKU and see when she'll be in the area. Maybe she could do a Bullitt talk in the spring.
I will tell her that you already, committed her to do this.
She'll love that.
I'm sure she will. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.